Koch from RWTH University, Department of Psychology in Germany. Professor Koch research also focused on cognitive control, task vision, and multitasking and so on. Professor Koch is also an editor for several international journals, including Journal of Cognition and Journal of Experimental Psychology, Human Perception and Performance. And in recent years, Professor Koch also closely collaborated with Professor Xie. So now let's welcome Professor Koch.
So, thank you very much for this kind introduction. And I would like to start my talk also taking my... Yep. Some other microphone is still open. So, is this gone, the echo? Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so I would like to thank my collaborators here in Tainan, Julian Xie and Pichu Nuam. And this project, Denise has already explained this, so I think I can keep this shorter here. And instead I show you a map of Middle Europe, Central Europe. And before I go into detail, I asked, who of you is in the master's program currently? Okay. And who is currently PhD student? Okay, so yeah, some. Okay, so for those who are in the masters, you might consider doing a PhD, or for those in the PhD, you might consider doing a postdoc. And Europe is a good location. Germany is a good location for that. Germany is here in the middle. It's a bit small for you, but here would be London. Here, this is France, this is Paris, and Aachen would be here in this area. And this is now a bit larger. So here you see London. Here you see Brussels. Here's Amsterdam. Here's Frankfurt am Main. And Aachen would be somewhere here. So Aachen is, this is Belgium, and this is Netherlands, and the Netherlands, they extend geographically down to the south. So Aachen is really, it's a point where three countries really meet, literally. So it's very nice. And they have the different languages, so it's also a nice area to do bilingualism research. Actually, we could do bilingualism research. This is a different presentation, and this is a map for where you see two different names. For example, Antwerpen, the Dutch name for the English Antwerps. In French, it's Anvers, so it's a different name. And also Aachen has a French name, and that's Aix-la-Chapelle. Chapelle means chapel in English, so it's very close, and chapel, well, cathedral. And this is what we have. This is the famous cathedral with the left-hand, somewhat lighter colored part being from the year of 800. So when Charlemagne reigned almost half of Europe, so he was the most important king at that time. So Aachen has a strong history, and we try to get it a strong scientific future, of course. Yeah, so this is the old Romantic part, and there's also a super modern Gothic part from 1300 something. This is here, this Gothic choir hall. You see it from the back, and there also in this little square there's a market, and we also have a Gothic town hall from, I think, 1300 roughly, and with a big square in front with fountain, and really very nice. So come see in the summer, it's very nice. All this place is crowded with people drinking beer. Yeah. So, but this is not about geography, but about bilingualism, this talk. And here, so probably you can read, well, can you read this? Well, I couldn't. I could read some other languages here. And apparently we have many words for the, well, in many different languages, many different words for the same thing. And so let's start with what is actually bilingualism. Well, at first I thought, well, bilingualism is when people grow up with two languages. For example, father speaks one language, mother speaks the other language. But obviously this is an overly strict idea because, well, I would consider myself being at least bilingual because I can communicate effectively in English, even though I was not raised speaking English and I learned English in school. So accordingly, I would be a late bilingual because the age of acquisition of my second language is much later than by early onset bilinguals who were raised bilingually already. In the European Union, survey data show that about 2/3 of the working age adults know at least one foreign language. So, and many live in other countries and or use other languages during their work. Like the scientists do, we also need to use English. So for all of us who are not English native speakers, we need to be bilingual, otherwise we would fail in our job. But that's effortful. And the question is, why? So somehow I need to make sure that I don't, that I try to use proper English pronunciation and don't start pronouncing words with too strong German accent or just sneak in some German words, so-called language intrusions. I can manage, but it really requires energy. The question is why? And I will try to explain some of the reasons why this is the case. In terms of major background issues, I would say, and I have already alluded to it, one of the big challenges in this type of research is how can you define bilingualism? Apparently this is very difficult. How can we measure language dominance? For example, usually my German is much stronger. That's my first language compared to my second language. But if you ask me now in this minute to name objects where you could sit on, I would probably find it hard and would take longer than if you ask me, well, that's a chair. So I would need to say, okay, Stuhl. So I would hesitate because I'm really in the English mode. So in that case, currently English needs to be the dominant language, even though in other circumstances I would always spontaneously speak in German. So it's difficult to measure because it's so context dependent. And well, am I suppressing my German right now? So what am I doing? So I speak English, but so maybe I just activate my English very strongly and I don't do anything to my German, just sits peacefully in the back of my mind, that doesn't feel oppressed by somebody like me. So who knows? A difficult question. I will provide you with some answers later. And this bilingual control, is this language specific? So do we have we evolved special linguistic mechanisms? Or is this just domain general cognitive control, just the way I'm able to select a visual stimulus, even though I could also select the auditory stimulus. I select English language, I could also select German language as long as I have both at my disposal. So these are the interesting questions. I will come back to them later. And this is the overview. I will explain a few very general things first. Then I will briefly introduce a methodology that has already been introduced by the former speaker, my colleague Denise Stefan. Then I will present some basic findings, talk about mechanisms, give some empirical evidence, and come to conclusions. If I'm too fast, or if I'm just too unclear, please stop me and ask questions, or well, keep your questions in memory and ask me later. Okay, so cognitive control generally, and we have seen a lot about cognitive control in the earlier task, is required in situations where you have several options. So for me, well, speaking in several languages, and now my task is to speak English and not to use the dominant language. Here in this famous Stroop example, participants are tasked with naming the color of the letters. Unusual task, clearly not the dominant task when you see a word, to name the color of the letters. But here, this guy would have to say green, even though the sequence of the letters would form the word blue, and they cannot help but read the word blue, but the task is to say green. Difficult. Sometimes you have to stop something that you would like to continue. It's also difficult. It requires inhibitory control. Here you have to do some strategic planning, and maybe you need to shift your strategy because your opponent also has plans of his own. So these are the types of situations that require strong control. So selective attention, planning, inhibition. And it also requires a representation that somehow implements this control. And when it comes to representation, we have rather cloudy ideas of how they could look like. So this is such a cloudy idea. That's the task set. And the task set needs to specify the information needed to do a certain task. For example, there must be the attentional goal, so speak English in my case now, rather than speak German. The set of relevant stimuli, so in my case, so in my mental lexicon I have my English vocabulary, I can retrieve the words and sequence them and output them, and that's what you hear, what you're hearing. A set of relevant responses, so okay, I was too fast now, so that would be the actual speech you could hear, and the set of the relevant stimuli would be the lexical entries in my memory. And there's also some mapping that you typically have. All this has been explained very well in the task before. And cognitive control now implements a task set, and the processes that implement the task set are selection, updating, shifting, inhibition, and this corresponds well with a proposal made 25 years ago by Akira Miyake and his colleagues, and they suggested that the core components of cognitive control are shifting, inhibition, and updating, and these are overlapping components, so partly independent, partly overlapping, and when it comes to the shifting component, this can be assessed quite well with experimental paradigms requiring switching, for example, task switching, as we have heard before, or language switching, as we will see next. I will not focus on that. So now I come to the bilingualism question, and I will return to the question, so why is it actually so difficult? here's an example. So, are there any people here who like cats? Okay, and dogs? Okay, great. My examples will be about cats and dogs. So, Hund is the German word for dog, and Katze is the German word for cat. And when I think about a nice, cute kitty, then, well, this is my concept. So nice and cute. This will activate the German word Katze, but well, currently I need to speak English, so I should say cat instead. But how can I decide? So it's all in my memory. All the words in my vocabulary is somehow stored in long-term memory, and this is called the mental lexicon. And probably that's all thrown in one big bin. And how can I separate the words from one language and not use the words from the other language, even though they are close by? Probably, as you see here, strongly associated, because these are translation equivalent, and this creates conflict. I have two words for the same things, and both are activated at the same time, because this is one of the major insights from this type of research, that in the mind of bilinguals, the currently not needed language will never be completely deactivated. You will all the time have it at your disposal. So when you think of something in one language, you will also have increased activation of the same words in the other language. So here there is interference. And somehow this needs to be resolved. In some situations there's more interference than in other situations. For example, in a single language situation like now, for me there's a bit less interference. I can manage fairly well. Also, if I could assume that you are all fluent German speakers, and if I was a fluent Chinese speaker, then we would also have a very easy time, because I could just use any wording, or could say half of the sentence in one language, the other in the other language, and you wouldn't mind, because for you it doesn't matter, you will understand me anyways. That would, you find something sometimes in certain contexts when bilinguals talk to each other, they really will mix everything, so chaotic. This is called dense code switching. But even there, it's not random. So still, people can control very well which language they use. But it's fairly easy in this case. Really difficult is the so-called dual language context, when you really need to make sure you speak in one language or in the other, because if you mix the languages, the other person will not understand you. So well, if I now switched to German, I would be pretty sure very few people would understand me. So it's really vital that I have this language control. And if you now consider yourself being at an international conference, you're standing in front of your poster presentation, and your Chinese or Taiwanese colleague joins you. Probably you would start Chinese among each other, and then some language ignorant person like me, not knowledgeable in Chinese, would come. You would have to say things to me, explain things to me in English. But then your other colleague might ask a different question in Chinese, and then how would you respond in English or in Chinese? So, well, this is really very difficult. Yeah. So now you understand the problem, and well, here we will try to find solutions, at least to a better understanding of what is going on. And this solution will include the switching methodology, and Denise already has explained this. I can be a bit faster here. So this is about task switching, and here I show you examples how this could be applied to language. And first here to the left you have a language perception task. This is a very easy task in general, so you have a simple classification task. For example, here it would be an animacy judgment task. So is the word, or does the word refer to a living or to a non-living thing? Auto means car, German word for car, and that's, well, some people love it as it is a living thing, but it's dead, it's mechanic. So non-living, but a monkey is living, a horse is living. So, and here you have a language switch, auto, car, to monkey, English, horse, English. And it would be, for example, press the left key for non-living and right key for living. Very, very easy. And the question is, would you slow down in this classification task if there's a switch in the input language? Suggesting, well, if that was the case, this would suggest that when you understand a word in one language, this will positively prime this language and would possibly also have a negative influence on accessibility when reading a word in the other language. I would not focus on language perception today. So I'm saying here that many studies found these switch costs, small switch costs in this task, but I'm focusing on language production tasks. There, one version, for example, I give you different examples, would be you present single digits as stimuli. Digits are not language specific. You can name them in any language, and participants got instructions whether they should name a digit in one language, say English, or another language, Chinese or German. For example, if I say this in German, then would be 7, so German for 7, and then it would be 3, 8, so there would be a language switch in between. And this task produces quite strong switch costs. So it's really hard when you have to actively search in your memory for the name for an object to name it and to change the language if required. This is difficult. This is called cued language switching, and I have another example, and that's cued picture naming. And in cued picture naming, you would see this. Well, who knows the German word for this thing? Stuhl, right, so chair. Stuhl, very well. You see a picture? Horse, yeah. Bottle. You should have learned that by now, so this is a Stuhl in German. Well, this is difficult. So, okay. So maybe you can say this is the German word for window. What is this? Yeah. Now we are getting into cultural differences, so we would say that's breakfast. And for you it's tea with some irrelevant pastry. Mirror, yeah. That's a chair. Well, you remember previously this was associated with the German Stuhl. So you have learned a German word by now. But now you have gotten a feeling of how it is to participate in such an experiment. You have language neutral stimuli, and you need to select the names in one language or in the other language. Also, what I can mention here, some for example, a house. The German word would be Haus. So almost the same word. This is a so-called cognate word. And there are also words like Pferd and horse. So horse and Pferd is the same, but sound completely different. It's easier to use such words that are completely different, because with these words that sound very similar in the two languages, you can get all kinds of effects that nobody understands. So it's easy to control for phonological overlap. So today I will focus on bilingual language production. I will focus on paradigms that require two or more languages be active at the same time, and the paradigms require flexible switching. So this is the focus of today, and I just skip that and come to the findings. So again, back to cats and dogs. So this would be an example. So English, you see a dog, you say dog, well, you say Hund. Then you see a picture of a cat, but it was preceded by the English cue, and you would say cat. And this would be a switch trial, and there could also be a repeat trial, and in switch trials, performance is worse. So what could be the mechanism? There is one dominant approach in this type of literature, and this is that when you speak in your target language, you suppress the non-target language to make sure that it doesn't interfere. So it's about inhibition, and the degree of inhibition should be stronger the stronger your currently non-target languages. So my German is pretty good, so it should be suppressed very strongly right now, probably much more strongly than my French, which is sometimes just good enough. So these are two guiding ideas in this research, and we will also try to see whether they make much sense empirically. Yeah, I think I have explained all this already. So I would come to the empirical evidence. And if you are interested, there is a fairly recent paper authored by myself and a previous PhD student who is now a professor at the University in Brussels, Mathieu de Clercq, the concept of inhibition in bilingual control. As I mentioned, inhibition is really the major idea in this research. And there are four major empirical findings, and I will briefly mention three of them. So switch costs and its asymmetry. Here are famous data from Renata Meuter and Ellen Allport. Shula, did you ever meet?
We were in the same office.
In the same office, yeah. So I also co-authored two papers with Ellen Allport, who was the PhD supervisor of Professor Xie. Well, and here we see some of his data. This is the non-switch condition, the switch condition, the reaction times. L1 is the first language, L2 is the second language, and you see there are strong switch costs. And if you look into the L1 switch costs, they're actually larger in the L1 and the dominant language than in the L2, the non-dominant language. Very surprising at first, and then these smart authors came up with a very nice explanation, and they argued that because L1 is the dominant language, it needs to be suppressed particularly strongly, so when you then need to return to it, it should be particularly hard to reactivate it. So it's about lingering, so persisting inhibition that needs to be overcome, and because L1 is more dominant, the inhibition is stronger. So this is the idea, and then unfortunately some people got the idea to do a meta-analysis And Miriam Garde, another previous PhD student of mine, and Andrea Philipp, also another previous PhD student of mine, long time ago, and Alodire Name, and myself, we published this a couple of years ago, and here you see those data points. So to the right of this diagonal line, that show that the switch costs in the dominant language is larger than in the non-dominant language. So this, for example, would say there would be like 400 millisecond switch cost in L1, and then we go, and only 100 milliseconds in L2. There are some strange, so here you have 100 milliseconds switch costs in the L1, but in the L2 it would actually be a switch benefit. The effect goes in the opposite. So these are weird data points here. All the data should be actually here in this area. But if you look into the data, and I should mention a meta-analysis is, well, fairly objective, because you don't fall victim to or less victim to the citation bias. So you just look what is out there and not what is cited frequently. And then you find this, well, rarely cited, of course, but almost as frequent as the data points on the other side. So this means this famous asymmetry of the switch costs is just, well, there are many studies that find it, there are many studies that find the opposite. And nobody knows why they find one or the other.
The language did not control well, that's what I suspected. Because bilingual, it's difficult to measure how different it is.
Yeah.
Because for the generate that, based on my study, we replicate all the time, most of the time, 90% of the symmetrical switch cost to this paradigm use the emotional switch paradigm. That symmetrical effect is very stable.
Yeah.
Compared to the language.
Yeah. So of course here we try to find moderator variables, and most obvious is the language balance. So very unbalanced or balanced. That was an idea that only unbalanced bilinguals show this asymmetry in order to rescue the theory against unfriendly data. But even back then, people found inconsistent results, and here we really found much. This created strong. We made real enemies, I think, with this meta-analysis, because the theory is so strong, people believe so strong that it's like, I would say, God does not exist. But here we are talking about science and not about beliefs, and so we should be able to say that the asymmetry probably, well, it exists in some studies, and we don't understand well enough under which conditions this will come up. So there's another very, very interesting effect, and this is the so-called reverse dominance effect. Here we have data from another fairly early study from the Netherlands, and they did basically the same experiment, and they here are the data for the L1, and here are the data for the L2, and what you see is the switch costs, here indicated by this slope, is basically the same for both languages, but surprise, surprise, L1 is generally slower, even in the switch and in the non-switch, in the repetition condition. And this has also been termed the reversed language dominance effect, so that even though you are dominant in your L1, you're getting generally poorer in your L1 compared to the L2. But only in situations in which you are required to switch back and forth between the languages. As soon as people would go to a pure language condition, use only one language all the time, then the L1, the dominant language, would again produce the better performance. So this is a kind of mixing costs that is asymmetric. So in your dominant language, in your L1, you're really slowed down in order to make it easier to switch to your second language, and you're overdoing it a little bit. So you're and that would be a theoretical idea. You inhibit your dominant language more than it's necessary. Yeah. Okay. And now I would like to give you a final example, because before I come to conclusions. So, what we have heard so far is there is this nice asymmetry of the switch costs. This is usually taken as a super strong evidence for inhibition. And I have shown that the evidence is not strong at all, because it's not a robust finding. And in addition, you could say, well, I'm just activating my English, my non-dominant, my L2, very, very strongly. And because it's so strongly activated, it's hard to deactivate. Therefore, I need longer to switch to German, even though my German is not inhibited at all. It's just that I have made a competitor so strong that it's hard to fight it. Also with the L1 slowing, I could say, well, I overactivate my L2 to a degree that it generally becomes better than my L1, because the L2 generally competes so strong, which it otherwise would not do. So I don't need inhibition to explain these findings. And so we tried to come up with a new approach where we could measure inhibition while excluding this competing, this overactivation account. And for this we needed 3 languages. Here in this example it's French, German and English. And we used digit naming in the first studies, but we also replicated this with picture naming. And the general idea is when there are 3 languages, we can contrast 2 conditions experimentally. And according to the idea that inhibition is involved, we would say when I switch from German to English, I would need to suppress my German. Then I have to switch back to German. Just suppressed, this inhibition should persist and should slow me down when I switch just back. And here we have a control condition. French to English should suppress my French. And then I go from English to German, exactly the same as here, but the difference is that when I switch here from English to German, I don't have inhibited English just in the trial, German just in the trial before, and therefore this should be much easier. And this is in fact empirically the case. So we can measure inhibition, because persisting activation would predict just the opposite. Persisting activation would say it should be good to repeat a language that was recent. And here it's less recent. And it's bad when a language was recent. You can apply this logic to all the languages, so you can come up with inhibition scores for all the languages. And here I show you old data. ADA, that's the inhibition condition where you just go back to a language you have just switched away from, and this performance is worse than in the control condition, so this is nice. When we look into the data specifically, we found that for L1 the effect was largest, and for the other languages it was smaller. And here you already see a first inconsistency. For L2 it should be stronger than for L3, but it was not. And later experiments also did not find very consistent effects here. We did one study with Turkish-German bilinguals, and we found that both the dominant languages are suppressed, and for English the effect was a bit smaller. We recently replicated this data, the paper is submitted. We used picture naming, and we could not really replicate this very well. Effects were generally much smaller, and we found the effect primarily in German. We don't know why. I assume that's because of the internet, of smartphones. People are generally much more exposed to different languages, and our participants don't have the same language profiles they used to have 10 years ago. So this is a very interesting thing, but that's not experimental psychology, but more sociolinguistics, I think. In a more recent paper last year, we took inventory of all the studies out there, and using this paradigm, well, many of them from our lab, but also some other labs used this paradigm. And what was obvious is that in only half of the cases, the dominant language got stronger inhibition effects. Sometimes it was all the same, or sometimes even smaller. So this is really inconsistent, and really more research need to be done. So with this paradigm, we can demonstrate that inhibition is actually important in language control, but we don't know what the factors are that determine the degree of inhibition. This is completely unclear. So with this, I would like to come to the conclusions. So the four major empirical findings were asymmetric switch costs, well, I would say a red, big question mark. L1 slowing, I would say yes, small question mark. There are many studies that don't find the effect. Sometimes they still find overall better performance in L1. But here I think a meta-analysis, in terms of meta-analysis, the evidence is weak, but speaks in favor of the presence of this L1 slowing. So I would tend to believe in this effect. N-2 language repetition costs, yes, but again a small question mark, because, well, this effect still doesn't behave. It shows strong or weak effects for the dominant language, and we don't know why it's strong, or it should always be strong. And there's another effect which I didn't mention. There are few studies. I think this is very interesting, so please read the paper, but I'm not going into it. So back to the overarching questions. So how do we define bilingualism? So apparently this is not a simple concept. It has different dimensions. For example, age of acquisition, I mentioned that earlier. Also manner of acquisition. Did you learn it in school? Or informal? So in the last study I mentioned with the Turkish-German bilinguals, they were fluent Turkish speakers, so with Turkish ancestors or Turkish families migrated to Germany, speaking Turkish with the family, but growing up in a German-speaking environment in a German school system, learning English. So actually, well, even though they are fluent Turkish speakers, they rated their English as being better than their Turkish. So that is really very difficult to define what type of bilinguals they are. Proficiency, well, you can try to measure this, but also this is not difficult. There are placement tests when you need to if you if you like to study abroad, you need to give proof that your language proficiency is good enough, and you make a test, and they would say, okay, this is B2 or C1, or they place you somewhere. But also the validity is probably very unclear. Language patterns of language use. Do you use one language at work and the other at home, or do you have language switching all the time? Language identity. Which is the language that you feel more at home? So we had we had interesting discussions when we had this meta-analysis, because people said, well, we coded dominance incorrectly because our participants were dominant in their second language, and then, okay, so please explain me what dominance is. How do you define dominance? And we thought we just take what the researchers reported as L1 and as L2. What else could we do? So really, yeah. So very difficult. And if we are to understand the concept of language dominance better, we need to find a way to deal with this conundrum here. And people have tried to do it here. A group from Krakow, from Poland, from Zofia Wodniecka. They tried to apply a factor analytic approach with the idea that there might be a big bilingualism factor that can be broken down into second order factors like onset, proficiency, and switching. This doesn't seem to work very well according to their paper, and what they believe is that this is really more, that these are more independent facets that form a network, but there's really no hierarchy. So it's like a slightly ordered chaos. So it will be very difficult to define what the core of bilingualism is, because there is no core. You have these interrelated but partly independent different dimensions. So next question, is this always inhibitory? Well, I've shown that empirically it's possible to find strong evidence for the contribution of inhibition, but of course there are also many other mechanisms that might be even more important. So maybe inhibition is just completely overrated in terms of importance. So if you could deactivate my inhibition module in my brain, probably I would still be able to give this talk. So probably I would take a bit more time at some points. Domain specific or general? I can cut this short. There's a big discussion. Everybody is right, of course, because the answer is yes and no. And I would assume that at the higher level, so the decision whether I speak English now or German now, this is, I really think, a very general cognitive control issue, but probably how I control my pronunciation or the specific wordings that my mental lexicon presents me, this is probably really domain specific. These are linguistic processes that are probably more or less hard for me to access directly. So this is really, the local level is definitely domain specific. Yeah, and I think that is it. Thank you.
So, any question for Professor Koch?
Let me ask the audience first. 这里有没有语言专家？因为我不是。I just asked if any of them have this linguistics, because my first intuition is that because all the bilingual languages you studied, either French, Italian, or German, Spanish,
thank you. So this is more like a linguistics question, and in fact, the languages, well, the examples I've given came from languages that all use the same script, Latin, and we have the Germanic languages like English, Dutch, German, and there would be also the Romance languages like French, Spanish, Italian. So they would form subgroups. And actually, I'm not aware of studies that systematically examine the influence of language similarity, but there are really many studies out there studying bilingual switching between Chinese and English, and from mainland China, very many studies are published in that area, and they don't find, well, they find asymmetrical switch costs, and as a reviewer I always, and they celebrate this, and as a reviewer typically I say, well, but look in the error rates, or but look in experiment 2, you just found the opposite, where it is ignored. So this means this unclear, well, this inconsistent data pattern does not, at least not very obviously, depend on whether languages use the same script or a different script, or are very dissimilar or similar. I assume in the end there must be some factor that explains why sometimes you find the asymmetry in one direction, sometimes in the other direction. But currently we don't know what it is, and it doesn't seem to be the language dominance, or maybe this interacts with another yet unknown factor that would explain under which conditions language dominance predicts the asymmetry. So currently we don't, so my claim is not that the asymmetry does not exist or that the dominance is irrelevant, but currently I would say the theory doesn't work empirically. So it cannot predict the data. We need to find more evidence and additional variables, and then in combination, it's just more complex. And maybe in the end we will find that the theory works perfectly if we add just another important ingredient. Any other question?
We asked me, are they all the same? Also about